Right now, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Lisa Dale, lecturer at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Dr. Dale previously directed Yale's Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and that is I just saw someone go, I don't know if it was in connection with this, but which is a research center that is jointly hosted by the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Law School at Yale. Prior to that, she was Colorado's Assistant Director for Parks, Wildlife, and Lands from 2012 to 2015. She holds a PhD in Environmental Policy from Colorado State University, and she was on the faculty at the University of Denver for 5 years. She's written a textbook, numerous articles on environmental policy. So she spent a lot of time working both within academia and outside academia, including stints as a policy advisor for state government and as a researcher in the nonprofit sector. We live in interesting times. Last week, Scott Pruitt, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, suggested that maybe climate change is actually going to be a good thing. Who knows? First, some people used to deny that climate change was happening. And then they said, okay, it's happening, but it's not human caused. Then they said, well, okay, maybe some of it is human caused, but we don't know that it's actually going to harm anyone. I hope they're not saying that to the people of Puerto Rico, because the fact is that climate change is harming people now. The habitual cautiousness of scientists has made it hard for us to convey the urgency of climate change to non-scientists. Scientists cannot tell you with complete certainty that any given hurricane would not have happened were it not for climate change. But as Carrie Emanuel in atmospheric science, I feel like I'm being accompanied by a choir of bells. It's sort of an ethereal, angelic feel. As scientists have pointed out, we know that hurricanes are powered by the evaporation of water. And water evaporates a lot faster from a hot surface than from a cold surface. This is not rocket science, right? Late summer temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico are already more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they were 30 years ago. And we are seeing the results of that now in storm surges that flood coastal cities and hurricanes that are increasing in intensity. I can't help feeling that President Trump is like a man he's in a leaky lifeboat with 10 other people. And he's like a guy who is refusing to help bail because he feels like his bucket is too big and he's having to do an unfair share of the work. And so he just refuses to bail at all. We are all in that lifeboat together. We all have to bail. We'd be foolish not to do our share to bail it out. And environmental policy is what's going to help us patch the leaks in the boat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dale. I have really been I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but I've been really looking forward to hearing her speak on environmental policy 1 year into the Trump administration.
Thank you so much. I think we're having some technical. I'm pretty loud. I could just yell. This is very echoey. Sorry. Give it a second. Is it okay? It's not really okay. People are expressing pain.
Maybe we'll get some progress here.
Is that better? Is that any better? That might be a little better. Does that seem a little better? Okay, good. We'll go with it.
Is it good?
Thank you. I think so. I think we'll take it. You can hear me. It's not echoing. We're great. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm glad I made it. As some of you know, I was scheduled for 11 o'clock this morning, had travel challenges yesterday. They scheduled me for 4. Didn't make that one either. Here I am, so thanks for hanging in there with me. I'm really glad to be here, and thanks so much to Barb and the rest of the people at the center for making this happen. So this is really a privilege and a joy to be here. So this is my topic. This is what we'll talk about. I think I have about an hour, so I'll plan to try to talk for about 45 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So here's the person we're going to talk about today, and we're going to talk about the Trump administration and environmental policy. I'm a political scientist, so I come at this from a policy and governance lens. I'm not a natural scientist. So we're going to talk about elements of environmental policy that we've seen in the Trump administration in the first year of this presidency. So here's where we're going to go over the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to start with a little context and background, make sure we are aware of and thinking about where we were from a policy standpoint and where we were culturally when Trump came into office, because many of the dynamics that he has highlighted are not new, and we need to make sure we're aware of that. Then as we go through this, I'm going to frame the environmental policy changes that we've seen over the last year with three different lenses, to sound very academic on you. One is to think about environmental justice ramifications, and we'll talk about what that means and what it looks like. The other is to look at some of the durability of the changes that we've seen. There have been so many headlines, environmental policy headlines. It's enough to make you panic or rejoice, depending on how you feel about those policies. But if we dig beneath the headlines, we can ask questions about how durable those policies are when this administration eventually leaves office. And that's a useful frame. And then we'll also talk about the difference between process and outcomes. A lot of environmental policy is actually prescribing processes, ways that we are required to do environmental review, for example. So it's often more about process than it is about outcome. And so we'll look at the ways in which the changes we've seen affect either the process or the outcome, and how that matters and why it matters. And then I'm going to do a somewhat deeper dive into three particular policy issues. Now I think I lost my mic completely. Is it still on? Okay, you can. I'm loud. I'm from New York, so should be able to hear me. So I'll do a deeper dive on three particular policy changes. We'll look at the 2015 Paris Agreement, the climate change Paris Agreement that he pulled us out of, and we will look at that issue. We'll look at the proposed changes to national monuments in Utah and ongoing review across the West. And we'll look at changes to the EPA, to the Environmental Protection Agency. So we don't have time to look at every change in environmental policy. And if you're really interested in this stuff, there are a number of really good sort of trackers now that you can find online. A lot of people paying a lot of attention to this. Columbia's where I work now at Columbia University in New York City, the law school, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, has something they call the Science Tracker. And they're looking at all of the ways in which this administration is disregarding science. And so they have over 100 posts now every day when something happens that is not consistent with the science or is pushing science aside, they post it. And they're similar types of tracking mechanisms online. So there's plenty of places to go for more information, and we're going to focus on these three things just by virtue of time limitations. Okay, so some context. We have a long and deep tradition in this country of distrust for the federal government, and we heard some of that in the panel that we just enjoyed listening to. We heard we can solve this at the local level. This shouldn't happen in Washington. Some of the policies coming out of Washington are maybe not serving the agricultural community well, maybe not serving communities here in Iowa well. This is a time-tested American cultural attribute. We like to beat up on the feds. And so here we have little tiny state legislatures saying, get out of our business. This is especially a profound dynamic in the American West. So even though I'm in New York City now, I lived in Colorado for 25 years and worked on Western land issues, land use, agriculture, forestry, and public lands in particular. And the sagebrush rebellion in the West is rooted in this distrust and suspicion of the federal government. We see this movement now in the so-called Reclaim the Public Lands movement. You hear about this sometimes in the news. There was an occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon a couple of years ago in this tradition, which is the federal government not being seen as a legitimate authority. And this is quite common across the country and in particular in the West. It takes the form, and this is something that also came up in the conversation we just listened to, with a real push for deregulation, a real suspicion and dislike of being regulated. And we hear that all the time. This is not something new with the Trump administration. This is a drumbeat in American culture, and we have political responses to these winds that range, and we're on a far extreme of that with this administration, but these trends are not new. And this really often comes out in calls for states' rights, right? Sort of pushing away the federal government. And even further, a distrust of globalism, and we see that a lot in a distrust and suspicion of the United Nations as the representation of transnational and international cooperation. If you distrust the federal government, you probably distrust 194 federal governments sitting in a room together even more. It seems awful lot like a big conspiracy happening. And so these currents run deep in America. These are currents that have now been brought up to the surface in this administration and are driving a lot of the policy changes that we're seeing. We also see a long-standing partisan divide when it comes to trust in science. We see it very profoundly now in this administration, but again, this isn't new. You can see trend lines here, and it only goes to 2010. I would be very curious to see what this poll looks like today, but I couldn't actually find, I found data on today, but that data was collected differently than this trend line data, and I think the trend line is even more interesting, and I guess for the point that we need to wrap our heads around when we start looking at the Trump administration and how it's functioned in the environmental arena, we start with this disparity that's partisan and how much each party, and it's important to note, it doesn't say Democrat and Republican, it says conservative and liberal. Those are different matrices, okay, so that's important. But we have a partisan divide, an ideological divide over the role of science in policymaking and the trust that we might have in scientists overall. Okay, so now we're gonna walk through the three frames that I'm gonna use to talk about policy today, and the first is environmental justice. There are many dimensions of injustice, and scholars who study environmental injustice look at this from a number of different angles. The most obvious is racial discrimination or class discrimination in policymaking. That's relatively straightforward. But there are also some more hidden currents that have gotten a lot of attention in the research. Inequitable enforcement. If laws are not enforced the same way across the country, certain communities will suffer disproportionate impacts of environmental harm based on hard to track different levels of enforcement that are practiced. The most famous examples of environmental justice violations and the issue that brought this school of thought front and center in the 1980s was the discovery of intentional targeting of minority communities for hazardous waste sites. There was a whole lot of research done that showed that big chemical companies were intentionally choosing communities that were poorly equipped to fight back to site hazardous waste sites, right? If you're gonna dump a hazardous material somewhere, you're not gonna do it in a place that has the capacity to hire fancy lawyers and put up a big fight and throw a lot of money into the fight. You're gonna pick a site where you won't get a lot of pushback. And this became sort of the iconic environmental justice rallying cry in the early days. And so this line of research continues and is worth keeping in mind. And then the fourth piece of this, and this is something we see loud and clear in the Trump administration, is the exclusion of people of color from leadership positions in environmental policy. And certainly that's true across leadership in the Trump administration, not just in environmental policy. It's striking when you see images of his leadership and his cabinet is overwhelmingly white and male. When I think about environmental justice, these are the four dimensions that scholars tend to focus on. Most famously, or most recently, the news was full of stories about Flint, Michigan, and what happened there. And that was a budgetary decision that the city made to switch their water source. But it ended up looking and sounding a lot like an environmental justice problem. And so it looked like this. And it's a good example of how environmental justice can be a little bit insidious. Certainly, the town leaders of Flint, Michigan did not intend to discriminate when they made a decision to switch the water supply. But the result was a highly inequitable environmental health crisis that affected one portion of American society disproportionately. Right? So it became an environmental justice issue. Okay, so this is just, again, framing what we're going to go on to talk about a little bit more. Okay, so the second framing that we're going to apply to environmental policy here is the durability question. And the first thing to bear in mind, this is a president who has relied very heavily on the use of executive orders. And that image of him holding up an executive order has sort of become a meme, and you can find that online with cartoons or funny things written on the paper. Because this has really been his primary mode of governing since he arrived. There are limits to executive power, and executive orders, by definition, are only good for the duration that executive is in power. Many executive orders, as soon as a new administration comes in, they can write a brand new executive order and strike the same pose and it's over. There's no durability to executive orders. Most executive orders, in fact, don't do anything from a governance standpoint except direct others to begin a study or a review. So many executive orders make statements of principle, or they direct a member of cabinet to conduct a certain review, or they push Congress to take up an issue, but they don't actually do much. They are signalers. They are statements of priority, and that matters, right? They're political rallying cries, they're flags. It matters, but they're not as durable as we might think. So we can think about the relative durability of policy change along this continuum, which, if I was smart, I would have actually put this on the slide as a continuum, but I didn't, so bear with me. But that is intended to be a continuum. Statutory law is a law that goes through Congress. It's incredibly difficult to pass, especially with the Congress, the dynamics of Congress that we have today, but it's very, very durable. It's why most of the most powerful environmental laws that we have on the books today are passed 40 years ago. The big sweep of environmental lawmaking happened in the 1970s. Since the 70s, we've had very little statutory law in the environmental sector. Not none, but the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, the real pillars of environmental law in this country, are almost 40 years old. They're very durable. They're very difficult to pass, but once they're in, they're very durable. Next on my non-existent continuum up here is regulatory law. Those don't go through Congress, and regulations have to be tied to statute. So the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act function through a regulatory mechanism. Those regulations happen through a prescribed process, but they don't go through Congress. Congress doesn't vote on regulations. They're less durable. They're a little more agile and responsive. So when science points to new pollutants in water, for example, the EPA is authorized by the Clean Water Act to regulate those pollutants. But Congress doesn't have to do anything. because Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and now it's up to the EPA to regulate as science changes. Okay, next on my continuum is administrative law. This is where things like staffing, enforcement priorities, things that happen within agencies are happening. These are administrative policies. These are the handbooks that public land managers go out and tells them where to spend their day and what to do. This is even less durable, right? A new boss comes in and says, do it differently. That's it. That's all it takes. And then last are norms. And I think norms have been one of the headline stories of this administration is the degree to which we had come to accept so many norms as being, we sort of thought they were law, but they're not law. They're norms, and they're very easily discarded. Somebody can get up and say something that seems completely outlandish, and it turns out there's no law against saying outlandish things. It's a norm, and a violation of norms is destabilizing, I think, for a culture and for a society, but they're not very durable. They're even less durable. I already mentioned the media. I think the media often does not distinguish between these layers of durability. When it makes announcements about environmental policy changes, it's very difficult as a reader of the news to know which things are really happening, which things are just being talked about, an executive order, how worried should we be, what does it mean? And we have to remember we still have markets. And so a lot of the promises and policy agendas that we hear coming out of Washington rely on an open market to enact. Bringing back coal, for example, is something that may be a political priority but is running up against some market realities. So these are all sort of elements to keep in mind when we think about durability. They're factors. Okay. I'm going to just talk quickly about process and outcomes because this is, I think, less critical. This is just an image of a public meeting, and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, prescribes a process. It's a process law. And what NEPA tells us is that anytime a federal agency wants to take a major action, it is required to conduct an environmental review. That environmental review is required to include public comment. That's what's happening in that photo. It doesn't tell us anything about outcomes. It's a process law. So we can hold 1 million public meetings and then the agency can make a decision that the public doesn't like, as long as the process is followed, okay? And this again ties back into norms. So we talked a little bit about norms. And in this country, in a democracy, a deliberative process is something we have really come to expect. That's a norm. That's not a law. But we have come to expect the integration of science, the integration of public input, and a slow and thoughtful process as environmental policy is developed. This is now being put into question. So, for example, Trump has already announced that he is going to waive NEPA requirements for the building of the border wall if it gets funded. He's disregarding NEPA. And the executive can do that. Previous executives have not done so, but he does have the authority to do that. Okay, so let's look at the 3 issues. Now I've set up sort of the framing of how we're going to look at and analyze the 3 issues. And we'll look at 3 of what I think are the most interesting or important environmental policy changes we've seen in the first year of the Trump administration. So the 2015 Paris Agreement, Paris Climate Change Agreement was a huge international victory. That's a photo of the major parties at the Conference of the Parties in Paris in 2015 celebrating the signature. I want to very briefly describe the key pieces of the Paris Agreement so that we can understand what a withdrawal from that agreement means. The Paris Agreement includes elements that speak to both pieces of climate change policy. So those 2 pieces are mitigation and adaptation. You're probably familiar with this. Mitigation climate policy is anything that has to do with reducing emissions. These are all the policies that try to, for example, shift away from fossil fuels and toward renewables, that try to shift our transportation use, try to shift agricultural practices. everything that tries to reduce emissions and reduce climate change from happening. Adaptation is different. Adaptation are all of the policies that seek to adapt to an already changing climate. So in New York City, there's a lot of effort happening on building flood walls and thinking about rebuilding Lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy. Those are all adaptation. We're not trying to reduce emissions, but we're trying to better adjust our way of life to a changing climate, to rising seas. And so throughout the globe, countries are working on both mitigation and adaptation policy pieces in different bounds, depending on which country we're talking about. And the Paris Agreement addressed both of those buckets of policy. And this is the really important thing to realize about the Paris Agreement. What made the Paris Agreement both such a success and so unique is its brilliant design. So the Paris Agreement was designed to be bottom-up. Unlike previous attempts at international climate policy, like the Kyoto Protocol, for example, the Paris Agreement, the architects of the Paris Agreement took a different strategy, and each country was asked to submit their INDCs, their intended nationally determined contributions. In the acronym there, you take the I off because they become national contributions once it was signed. They were submitted as INDCs. Once the agreement was signed, they became NDCs. And so what's important about that is there is no global authority telling countries what to do. Every country made its own decision, its own ambition, and that's the buzzword in climate policy is ambition. So different countries have different ambitions. Some countries are very focused on mitigation. Western Europe, the US, China have a lot of energy, time, and money and resources going into mitigation policies. Countries in the developing world, throughout Africa, small island developing states, much more interested in adaptation. They have a much smaller role to play in mitigation. So their INDCs reflect both their capacity and their understanding of priorities for their particular country. And they wrote them themselves. So part of what, bear that in mind. Countries wrote their own INDCs. Nobody told a country what to do. So the US submitted our own and said, here's what we're prepared to do. And at the time, in 2015, the US was really in a leadership position, submitted a very ambitious INDC. Now, to make that work, you have to implement it at the domestic level. So the only way an INDC, a country submits an INDC and says, we're going to reduce emissions by 20%, we're going to invest in clean energy, we're going to do all these things. Then those countries have to go home from Paris and sit down with their own parliaments and their own congresses and their own people and translate those ideals into domestic law and make it happen. They have to implement it. So in the US, the primary tool for implementation was the Clean Power Plan. Never went into effect, was drafted, and was under review, and states were getting ready when the Trump administration came in. So the Clean Power Plan worked as a national law that asked states to develop new sources of power in an attempt to shift away from fossil fuels. When the Trump administration first came into power, one of the first things they did was put the Clean Power Plan on hold. It was in court anyway. It never went into effect, but it was halted. And the administration said it was going to bring back coal. So it was a dramatic shift away. But what's interesting about this is what President Trump said when he said he was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement is he said, we got a rotten deal, and we need to go back and renegotiate. But let's remember, that's not what happened. There was no negotiation. Nobody gave us a deal. We wrote our own deal. So his stated reasons for pulling out of the Paris Accord don't line up with an understanding of how that accord was developed and how it works. So the ramifications of him pulling out of the Paris Agreement. There's been a lot written and said about a leadership gap on the international stage. I think it's important to note, very important to note, that a lot of the action had already shifted away from the federal government. We have a lot of things happening in the private sector, at the state level, at the municipal level, nonprofits. So a lot of things are happening that didn't require federal support. But federal support matters, and the U.S., as its role on the international stage, we are now really isolated. And this makes that point pretty clearly. And in fact, since this graphic, both Syria and Nicaragua have indicated their intention to join. So the U.S. is the only country. But as I said, states and businesses and cities have stepped up even more strongly in the wake of this federal announcement. And I was at the subsequent Paris, the COP23, we just met in Germany, 2017 Conference of the Parties for Climate Change. And all the talk about the US was about what states are doing, what businesses are doing, what cities are doing. It was just sort of like ignore this one problem. And as we see here, there's a lot happening and a lot can happen we call it the sub-state level. It's confusing because in the US, our sub-state level are called states. But generally, internationally, when we talk about countries, we call them states. That's confusing. Okay, so let's do a little analysis now, apply our three lenses to this problem. So when we talk about environmental justice and we talk about climate change, the conversation is a little bit different, and the dimensions are a little bit different than the four that I put up there when we initially talked about environmental justice. When we talk about climate change, scholars of environmental justice tend to talk about four dimensions. They focus on who suffers the consequences of climate change, who caused the problem of climate change, who is expected to act on climate change, and who has the resources to do so. Okay? Those are dimensions of environmental justice when we look at it on an international scale, particularly with a focus on climate change. And I chose this image because I think it makes the point really clearly. A place like the Solomon Islands is suffering the consequences, had very little to do with the onset of climate change because their emissions are minuscule. They have some expectation to act, but almost entirely in the adaptation sector. Very little they can contribute from a mitigation standpoint, and they have very few resources to do so. So we are presented with an environmental justice problem, and with the United States absconding on its responsibility in that sector. Durability